gives me great pleasure to come and share our research on fructose with you again. The last time I presented this group 2 years ago, we were just completing our first series of systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and now we've completed those and we have some updates that I'm very pleased to show you, although I think what you'll find is the conclusions haven't really changed very much. So make sure I get this right.
Yeah.
So I have to follow in the footsteps of my two mentors, David Jenkins and Vlad Vuksan, and make sure that I give you all of my conflicts of interest. So here I'm involved with some guidelines development. We've had agency and industry support. Everything I'm going to present to you is supported by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. So that's the first thing there. And perhaps my most important conflict of interest is my wife. So I do share a pillow with industry. She works for Unilever Canada. But I can assure you she's been well trained by Furio Briganti, who is her PhD supervisor, and she's my biggest critic. So you can bear that in mind. So if coming back to tell the fructose story, not much has changed, but I think where things have changed is in the public realm in terms of a paradigm shift. So I think we've fully, there's been a full paradigm shift from a fat-centric view of cardiometabolic disease to a sugar, and I put in brackets, a fructose-centric view now of cardiometabolic disease. And when I last showed you this slide, it would have been full of commentaries and letters and editorials in the scientific literature. Well, now the media lag has passed, and it's all in the public domain. In some very high-profile journals, be it Time Magazine, or in Canada we have Maclean's, and also a series of now documentaries, which I think really illustrate how it's arrived on the scene. Fed Up, we had one recently, the Sugar-Coated, and the Australian film, That Sugar Film. And we see it also appearing in particularly esteemed publications, the New York Times, the most important financial paper in the world, the London Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and so on. So it's fully, I think the transition is done and the media lag is passed, and it's now sort of in the forefront. Well, I think, whoops, let me see if I can get this going. This has obviously had an influence, and vice versa, on guidelines. I think it's put pressure on a number of guidelines committees to make sugars a nutrient of concern and interest, and certainly to reevaluate the evidence. And we have evidence of that. The WHO, in reviewing ostensibly the same evidence, certainly at the 5% level, came up with a new conditional recommendation for less than 5% for free sugars. The USDA in the DJC report also did a special look at sugars and came up with a less than or equal to 10%, and then the Sacken report, which targeted less than or equal to 5% to achieve a population level of less than 10. So sugars are also very much in dietary guidelines, and this is further fueling, I think, this concern. Well, what are the charges against fructose? Well, they haven't really changed, and I take this from Rob Lustig's paper that was published in Nature, and I'm just going to quote George Bray. It's all about the fructose. It's really related to the fructose. And in this paper, Rob compares the chronic exposure to fructose to that of the chronic exposure to ethanol. And where ethanol is good for, I'm guessing there's a pointer, here we go. For these 12, if you like, cardiometabolic, mostly cardiometabolic insults, fructose is good for 8 of those. In particular, the insulin resistance, dyslipidemia, the corollary to alcoholic fatty liver, the non-alcoholic fatty liver, obesity, and so on. Well, I think we have to ask, what is the evidence? A lot of this has been dominated, and we're getting more and more evidence, but it's really been dominated a lot by animal studies, ecological studies in particular, looking at population levels of intake and just doing simple correlations without any adjustments, and human studies at supraphysiologic doses. But I think we have to ask, really, what is the evidence? It's very easy to critique the evidence, but I think we need to really take a hard look at it and ask, what is the evidence? And I think we need to really apply an evidence-based framework, and I was pleased to see Professor Sachs, he certainly made that definition early in his presentation in terms of levels of evidence, where we want to really focus our attention, I think, at the highest level of evidence, at systematic reviews and meta-analyses, in particular of controlled feeding trials, where we can get to the efficacy question, as was pointed out. And then below that, really, the next level of evidence that we really look at in terms of guidelines development, which would be cohort studies, prospective cohort studies, so well-conducted, high-quality observational studies where we have good assessments of the exposure, confounders, and ascertainment of the outcome. And the rest really don't factor in as much. So if we apply this, and I'm going to try to move quickly so we can save time, to the cohort studies, well, what do we find? Well, not much has changed. We can ask the question, are sugar-sweetened beverages a special case? Well, I think they are. So where the observational evidence is very consistent is for sugar-sweetened beverages. So if we look across systematic reviews and meta-analyses of the observational evidence, across outcomes from diabetes through to stroke, we see a pretty consistent signal for sugar-sweetened beverages being related to these particular cases. But there are some caveats. One is that the relationship is only seen when looking at the extreme quantile analyses, the highest level of intake to the lowest. We don't tend to see it at intermediate levels. And even dose responses start at the highest level. The one exception for that would be gout. Another issue is the adjustment for energy. If we adjust for energy, and there's some debate over whether one should do that, because it's thought to be on the causal pathway between the exposure to sugar-sweetened beverages and the outcome, we see a marked attenuation of a number of these associations, and it disappears for overweight and obesity. So still some caveats. The relative risks tend to be quite small, and then there's the issue, which is true of all observational evidence, and that's that of both measured and unmeasured residual confounding. And in particular, I think as it relates to sugar-sweetened beverages, this important, I think, collinearity effects that need to be considered, and that high consumers tend to also consume more calories, they exercise less, they smoke more, and have a poor dietary pattern by how we would define that. But despite those caveats, it's the most consistent signal we see in the observational evidence. So I think we can ask, why is it that sugar-sweetened beverages are the special case? Is it because liquid calories are poorly compensated? I think that's an open question. We have a meta-analysis by Adam Dranowski's group showing in terms of acute preload studies that liquid calories are more poorly compensated, but when we look at longer-term studies, and I'm going to make a plug for one of my students, they have a poster at the conference where we did the meta-analysis of longer-term studies. You don't see that this manifests in terms of a weight change, but those studies are very short, and the median follow-up is 6 weeks, and they're small. So I think that question still remains an open question, but a very interesting one. Is it because sugar-sweetened beverages are a marker of an unhealthy lifestyle, and that goes to the collinearity? Or what I want to address here, is it the sugars or the fructose? Well, we did a series of systematic reviews and meta-analyses to answer the latter question about, is it the sugars or fructose? And we wanted to look in the same prospective cohorts to see, do we see this signal when we look and model total sugars, total sucrose, total fructose, as well as other, I think, important sources of free and added sugars in the diet. Now, I don't have time to go through all the data, because we're going to have to move quickly, but I'll show you that for weight and for diabetes risk. And what I'll tell you is, Jay's in the room. Sorry, Jay, I'm not going to show your data for hypertension, but the issue here is that the evidence actually aligns closely for all of this, the only exception being gout. We do not see an association with total sugars, fructose, or sucrose for these other outcomes, the one exception being for gout. If we look at weight, so this was done by Shauna Kim before she left our group. She's doing a master's in another group right now. She looked at over 1,000 papers, and she unfortunately only found 2 cohorts. We know the data is there. People have measured the exposures and measured the outcome, but there's only 2 that have been reported, but still in over 32,000 individuals. And what she shows here, and this is in the 2 cohorts in particular, is that there's no association when you model total sugars and weight gain in 2 cohorts. But she asked another question, which I thought was an interesting one too, where she wanted to look at foods containing fructose-containing sugars other than sugar-sweetened beverages and whether they have an association. So she screened 400 papers for this and found 7 cohorts in this case. And this was actually the finding also in the WHO Commission Systematic Review that was published in 2013 that was the basis for the WHO guidelines. And didn't get a lot of play in that, but it was in their supplementary. But we found the same thing. If you actually look and model then sweets in relation to weight gain, you see these two guys out here. But in general, when you put all of these data together, I mean, and this is impressive in that you can see the confidence intervals are very tight. You do not see an association with weight gain. In fact, if anything, it's on the other side in terms of decreasing. But I think it gives us confidence that there's no an association. And it does have a lot of heterogeneity, though, because of these 2 studies. So I think it's still something I think we have to be careful in terms of having too much confidence in, but I think it gives us assurance that there's not an association with sweets, which again raises the question, is there something special about sugar-sweetened beverages? If we look at diabetes risk, we find the same thing. So this was done by Kristen Sillis. She screened over 6,000 papers, so she had a lot of work to do. And she looked at total sugars, total fructose-containing sugars, in particular sucrose and fructose. And she screened, again, over 6,000 papers and found 17 cohorts and 300,000 individuals. And what she found here is if you model total sugars with diabetes, and this is largely in the same cohorts that were used to implicate sugar-sweetened beverages, we do not see an association with type 2 diabetes in these same cohorts. And if we say, well, is there something maybe special about the fructose-containing sugars? What if we look at those? She modeled those. This is for sucrose and fructose. Again, no association with diabetes. Again, suggesting in these cohorts it may not so much be the sugar as something special about the sugar-sweetened beverages which is coming out. But I think we can ask the next question, which she didn't ask, but there's been meta-analyses that have. What about the relation with other fructose-containing foods and diabetes? Do we see the same relation that one sees in sugar-sweetened beverages if we model sweets and cakes and pastries and other foods? Well, that's been done by a series of systematic reviews, and we put our own in. And here, actually, I separate the data out for sucrose and fructose to show you that it's the same here. But when we see the relation here with sugar-sweetened beverages. We see the relation, I'm sorry, these moved up, with sugar-sweetened beverages or fruit drinks, if you like. So where these are fruit beverages where they've added a number of sugars. We see the relation here. And these have similar collinearity issues, which is interesting. But when you model 100% fruit juice, you do not see the relation with type 2 diabetes. If you look at cakes, pastries, and sweets, or cakes and cookies in this case, we do not see the relation with diabetes. And if we look at fruits, we actually see it's protective, which I think we would hope to find. What I didn't put in here, but I'm trying to model right now, but they don't tend to separate out by containing sugar or not, is yogurt, because most of the yogurt is consumed sweetened, certainly in North America. And if we were to put that in, that would also show a protective association. So it very much depends probably on the food form in which one's consuming these added sugars. And here again is our data just looking at total sugars, total sucrose, and total fructose from the same cohorts, not showing an association. So this is something we've seen across these endpoints, and Jay published his in the Journal of American College of Nutrition just last year, and he showed the same thing for incident hypertension. The one exception, again, being for gout. Now, what about when we look at systematic reviews and meta-analyses of controlled trials? Do we see some agreement then with the cohorts, which I think is the ideal scenario, and Dr. Sachs sort of raised that when we can get agreement between these two levels of evidence. What do we see? Well, we have two design types that allow us to isolate the effect of fructose and separate it from that of its calories. We have substitution trials. These are isocaloric substitution trials in which the comparisons are matched for energy with fructose substituted or swapped simply for another sugar holding calories to be equal. And then we have addition trials where the fructose has been added or supplements a control diet, so added on top of the control diet compared to the same control diet without those sugars, so necessarily an increase in calories, so without those added sugars, without the excess calories. Well, what can we learn from these two? Well, we've done a series of systematic reviews. We've published a number of them. We have a couple more now that are just working their way through the journals that Adrian put together from his glycemic control, but we have certainly these 7, and we have one looking at catalytic effects. And what I've done is I've summarized these 7. A number of these people are actually in the room and helping, so thank you to all of you for your hard work on these. Well, what did we see with the substitution trials? Well, we have 2 types of substitution trials that I want to, or two analyses of the data that I want to show you. So substitution trials versus any carbohydrate that they've looked at, and then to get to the question, which I think is an important one, substitution trials in which they've compared fructose with glucose, because we're seeing an increasing suggestion that we should be replacing the fructose in our foods, which would necessarily increase the glycemic index, with glucose as a potentially better sweetener. So if we look at versus any carbohydrate, and this is the primary analysis from all of our trials. So what I've done here is I've just made a super plot looking at all the endpoints from body weight through to fatty liver that we looked at. This represents data from more than 50 trials and more than 1,000 individuals across different metabolic phenotypes. A large dose range from small doses to really mega doses, much more than is typically consumed, and follow-ups ranging from 1 week to up to a year. And what we find across these, which was quite gratifying, is that there is no effect of fructose when it's isocalorically substituted for any other carbohydrate. But in fact, a calorie is not a calorie, because what we found, and I wouldn't say unexpectedly, because there was some suggestion in the early 80s that fructose might be an important alternative sweetener. We see a clinically meaningful improvement in glycemic control. The reduction in hemoglobin A1C here was equivalent to about 0.56% reduction, or about 0.5% reduction, which is at the same level that you would expect from oral agents at the lower limit of efficacy, and it's above the FDA threshold for a clinically meaningful effect, which they define as 0.3. So we didn't design these really to look at the question of benefit, but I think it certainly gave us some confidence that there wasn't harm. And we see actually an improvement in blood pressure and a tendency for an improvement actually in insulin sensitivity, which was quite interesting, but certainly no signal for harm when you simply swap the fructose for any other carbohydrate. Now, but what about the question versus glucose? And I have to actually thank Professor Sachs for this question, because he invited me to submit a paper to Current Opinions in Lipidology on this versus Rob Lustig. I'm not sure if he submitted his. And instead of just writing a sort of an opinion piece, we thought, well, we'll just update our meta-analyses and redo them all for glucose and look at that question. Should we be replacing fructose with glucose? What do we see? Well, here when we look at the substitution trials, there is no clear evidence of harm or benefit either way, but there are situations where it kind of goes back and forth. So if we look at body weight, actually fructose compared with glucose isocalorically led to less weight gain or actually weight loss, which I think was interesting, and that might get to the malabsorption of fructose, and maybe it's an issue of just not absorbing those calories, but certainly confidence that there's no weight gain. We looked at postprandial triglycerides. We do see an increase here compared with glucose, matched feeding. And we did see an increase in uric acid, where we did not see these things with any other carbohydrates. But then we also saw more pronounced, actually, benefits in terms of the blood pressure, or similar, I should say, to what we saw versus any carbohydrate. And then the improvement in glycemic control. So not clearly harmful, not clearly beneficial. It probably depends on what your health goals are, but no clear evidence of harm or benefit, or certainly no suggestion that replacing glucose with fructose would lead to necessarily a population-level benefit. Now, what about the addition trials? So again, we have the substitution, isocalorically swapping the fructose for any carbohydrate or glucose. The addition trials where we add the fructose again on top of a control diet compared to the same control diet without those extra sugars or calories. Well, then you see everything that people are talking about in the media and that Rob Lustig has in his table, deadly effects from nature. Here you see, with few exceptions, increases in body weight. You see the increase in ApoB, an increase in triglycerides, increase in postprandial triglycerides, fasting glucose. We see an increase in insulin resistance or markers of insulin resistance, an increase in uric acid, and an increase in fatty liver markers, both intrahepatocellular lipid and ALT. So then you see it. But in the absence of seeing that association, so I should say that effect, when you, in isocaloric substitution, seeing it in these addition trials necessarily suggests really it's the added calories or the excess calories that are driving the effect that we see here in the absence of seeing it for the other studies. So what are the takeaway messages? Well, these haven't really changed from the last time we spoke. So large prospective cohort studies have not shown a significant relation of fructose or fructose-containing sugars intake with incident cardiometabolic disease, with the exception of gout, and with the exception really of sugar-sweetened beverages. That's where we see these associations. If we look at the trial evidence, I think we have moderate quality evidence from those controlled feeding trials that fructose at low to moderate doses, but even at the high range, but we'll say safely, certainly at low to moderate doses, in isocaloric substitution for other carbohydrates, that's any type of carbohydrate that replaces it, does not harm body weight, fasting or postprandial lipids, insulin sensitivity, uric acid, fatty liver, and so on. And there may even be benefits, I think, which are interest for future investigations, potentially low GI type fructose interventions, benefits on glycemic control and blood pressure in humans. I think there's also a moderate quality evidence from controlled feeding trials that fructose consumed under hypercaloric feeding conditions where it's being overconsumed, providing the excess calories, that you do get the weight gain, the fasting, and postprandial dyslipidemia, raised uric acid levels, fatty liver markers, and so on. But an effect that appears to be more attributable to the excess energy when you compare these two designs than the fructose itself. Now, a caveat is the designs, these studies are, I should say, they're short duration, they tend to be poor quality, there's quite a bit of unexplained heterogeneity. So there's a number of caveats that I think should give us pause and are sources of uncertainty in these analyses. And I think really highlight the need maybe for some very large, well-powered, high-quality trials at real-world doses, the ones that we actually consume. And I would argue, too, in real-world foods, the actual foods in which these are consumed as opposed to pure doses, or doses of pure fructose versus any other carbohydrate. And in particular, we have an interest maybe is even looking at small so-called catalytic doses and their potential benefit in people with diabetes. So the implication is, I agree with our colleague who couldn't be with us, David Ludwig, who has been mentioned several times today. He did a very nice short synopsis in JAMA examining the health effects of fructose. And it was very gratifying that he came to the same conclusion. Therefore, the recommendation to replace fructose with glucose lacks an evidence basis. And I would go and be a little more provocative, a step further, and maybe challenge some of the ideas around the use of fructose as a low glycemic index sugar, that fructose can actually be safely used to replace glucose as long as it's under isocaloric conditions, or starch in foods as a means for lowering the glycemic index. And I would say if you want to be on the safe side, we could say at a level obtainable from fruit. I know that was in the comments that Alfred showed, and I think that might have come from our group. It looks quite familiar. But I would say certainly at a level obtainable from fruit, but we show if you're replacing one-for-one cold and calories equal, I would say even at higher doses, it's probably safe. So with that, I'd like to thank the research group and all of those people that worked on this. Thank you. Oh, I should say before, Jeff, before you ask your question, we built on your work, and I wanted to give credit to you, because Jeff did one of the first really, really beautifully designed meta-analyses back in 2008, and he beat us to the punch, if you like, but showed all of these data. We just simply updated it since then. So Jeff, please, your question.
I think it's great you've done all these studies, because it's showing us that it really is important to get the right comparators. You think about some of the long-term studies on feeding fructose versus glucose, and I've looked at a number of those. And my question has been, is there calorie compensation? Because if you get full calorie compensation, then you don't expect increased weight gain. And the picture has been that after 1 or 2 years, you get, as best we can prove, full calorie compensation, which to me suggests that, yes, you might give the extra energy and you might get the extra couple of kilograms of weight gain with fructose as an additional energy source. But really, it's not going to explain the whole range there is in differences in body weight and obesity. It's really not enough to explain. So I think there's that additional message to come out yet.
I think it's an important one. I didn't have time to show it, but we also looked at the question, is there something special about fructose when it's overconsumed or provides excess calories? So matched overfeeding studies. They match overfeed the fructose and any other carbohydrate. And in those cases, actually, we find that there is no difference. And we look at restrict our analyses just to glucose. Again, you still see less weight gain than you do with the glucose, which would go to your point. Professor Sachs.
Yes, no, great update and fascinating overall results. But what I'm curious about is in the observational studies, the cohort studies. I guess you're really not able to set up the multivariable analysis to do substitutions the way we've done with dietary fatty acids and total carbohydrate. I wonder what your thoughts are. It might be interesting if you could do a pooled analysis.
I would love to do a pooling project where we could get all these cohort investigators together and we could ask that question about the substitution, because our data is showing, as Jeff pointed out, is the substitution probably is important, although across carbohydrates we didn't see it. I think the foods forms that it's in, I think, probably do matter, and so we should be looking at that. I agree. Yeah.
Right. So basically, the sugar-sweetened beverages, when people who drink a lot of those, what are they not drinking?
Right.
In other words, what are the ones that have? So compared to the high sugar-sweetened beverage drinkers, what about the low sugar-sweetened beverage drinkers? Do they just don't drink anything, or what kind of carbohydrate?
Well, what's interesting there, that's another presentation, which is if you look at the low-calorie, no-calorie sweetened beverages, where people, I think it could be argued, have made that swap, we see an increased association with diabetes. The relative risks are similar and the confidence intervals overlap, an increased risk of overweight and obesity, an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, stroke, metabolic syndrome. So, which I think really goes to this issue, there I think a strong argument's been made for reverse causation, and it was made even in the DJC, but I think it should give us pause at looking at a lot of this epidemiology about what it's really telling us. And I think that's getting at the substitutions is an important one. Yeah.
Jenny.
Okay, it's Jenny first and then Al.
Superb presentation, John, and superb research. Where I come from, sugar-sweetened soft drinks have already been demonized. They are just not needed because they're absolutely empty. There's no point in actually arguing any other way. But what I would say is if we design studies to look, randomized controlled trial studies to look at the consequences of soft drink intake, can we please have a reasonable control that it's not water, that it actually contains calories, and it might be reasonably used as a substitute for the sugar-sweetened soft drink. So it might be milk, and it might be skim milk in the best possible world for some people, all right? But in reality, if we look at adults and perhaps teenagers, teenage males, the substitute might be actually alcohol. So is there justification for doing a study versus sugar-sweetened soft drinks versus alcohol? And I'm not kidding, because at the ADA in Boston, the guidelines for people with diabetes, the first one was avoid, not limit, avoid sugar-sweetened soft drinks. And the 8th one was you are permitted to have alcoholic drinks up to 2 a day if you're female and 4 a day if you're male. okay, where it says avoid, and they're both empty sources of calories, and they're both social lubricants.
Right.
All right?
Excellent comment. I have nothing to add. I think that's just superb. Yeah, agreed. I mean, what I would say only is we have a couple trials, like the Maersk trial, where they compared milk with a liter of sugar-sweetened beverages with milk, where it was matched for calories. They didn't get their primary outcome, which was a change in weight, but they did fatty liver and some other ectopic measures. And I think we need to put it together with some more of the data before we can make a definitive conclusion. But I think you need more of those studies. But I think it's probably not ethical anymore because of the environment we're in. So the only studies we're able to do are basically reduction studies. You're going to have to recruit people that are already consuming them and have them carry on or reduce in some way. So I think we're also very challenged in terms of ethics, research ethics, at being able to do the type of study you're talking about. Alfred had a comment.
Yeah, it's a question. Great work, John. It's always very, insightful when I look at these types of studies, and they raise more questions than answers for me. So my question is, when I was very intrigued by when you show some of the data on sugar-sweet soft drinks, fruit drinks, and then fruit juice,
Right.
which you don't see any effect at all.
Yeah.
Which begs the question.
Yeah, you don't.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's on the side of benefit, but no association. Yeah.
Which begs the question about, is it a really dietary pattern? But then you do your randomized controlled trials, and you see whether it's fructose or it's glucose, if it's hypercaloric, if it's on the pathway to increase energy intake, then you see an effect. So I really want to understand what is really going on. So maybe you don't have the answer, but what is so special about soft drinks versus and fruit drinks versus fruit juices that you see sometimes an effect and sometimes you don't see effect with sugar?
So I mean, what I would say is, I think from the intervention studies with the limitations they have, I think it's pretty clear to me, and I think it could be argued, but it's a calorie effect that we're seeing. And when you take that evidence then as a lens to look at the observational evidence, the fact that you see it for sugar-sweetened beverages, you see it for fruit drinks, which I would argue could be classified as sugar-sweetened beverages and have a similar collinearity effects, yet you don't see it for pure fruit juice, so that kind of goes against the whole liquid calories issue. And the people that drink pure fruit juice, they're again a different chicken, if you like, in terms of the life they live and the things they do. And then you don't see it for cakes, pastries, and sweets, where when I try to look at a lot of those cohorts and look again for those collinearities, it's not as clear because those studies aren't as well reported in terms of their table ones to get at that. I still think it's sort of, to me, the special case, probably it may well be an epidemiological phenomenon, and really what you're capturing is the dietary and lifestyle pattern that goes with it. It tends to be associated with increased energy consumption. They are higher consumers of energy. They smoke more. They exercise less. They need a poor dietary pattern in general. So I think that sort of has to be, for me, and that's my opinion, sort of the most, the number one culprit. But I don't think we know. It's hard. It's very hard to disentangle. I mean, what I would say is this. One thing I would say is, if you look at dietary pattern analyses, and you look at a Western dietary pattern, which is the main one they identify, where the association with diabetes or heart disease, usually it's refined grains, processed meat, red meat, sugar-sweetened beverages, and potato products. That tends to be your Western pattern versus your prudent. In those, you see much bigger relative risks, like relative risks closer to 3 as opposed to the small ones. And they remain whether you adjust for any single component of the dietary pattern. So if you adjust that dietary pattern for sugar-sweetened beverage, the association remains, and the magnitude of that association is largely unchanged. And the same goes if you adjust for any other component, the red meat, the processed meat, which really I think gets, makes it more convincing to me there probably is a dietary pattern, and that's probably some residual confounding in the inability to really, in their multivariable models, to disentangle that.